Thank you, Father Dominic, for this invitation to speak and for that really overly generous introduction. And thank you to everyone for attending. It's really nice to be in this space and share with you all in this spirit of kind of interfaith openness and hospitality. So I'll just share my screen. Okay, is that visible?
Yes. It says you started screen sharing, can't see your... Ah, yes.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. So my title for today is Our Mother in Heaven, the Divine Feminine in Hinduism and South Asian Affinities. And my intention today is really just to offer a kind of glimpse, and that to a very selective and partial one, into this enormously rich and multifaceted topic. And I'll take a comparative approach, which means that my discussion will echo some recurring themes and notes across South Asian worldviews, rather than discussing the kind of specifics of one worldview. So perhaps we can think about these more as invitations or pointers to further discussion. I'll begin with some reflections on the Divine Mother in certain Hindu devotional universes, and this will be the majority of the talk. And then I'll attempt to bring these into dialogue very briefly with the Sikh tradition, often a tradition that's sadly quite neglected in our religious study scholarship, and the Islamic traditions. And all three of these traditions, of course, although we can't think about the social and historical dimensions here, have influenced and continue to influence one another in concrete and complex ways across the subcontinent. Okay, so with this kind of historical horizon in mind, let us turn to the year 1975, in which a crucial Bollywood movie, Jai Santoshima, was released, and because of which, within just a few months, a new goddess was being venerated across India. The title of this movie, which we might roughly translate as Hail to or Long Live the Mother of Satisfaction, celebrated a deity, Santoshima, the Mother of Satisfaction, who had been virtually unknown to most Indians, or at least she did not have a pan-Indian reach. Most who went to behold this divine mother on screen had no previous knowledge of or devotional ties with her. But as her celluloid rendering imbued her with life, Santoshima soon became one of the most significant and extensively worshipped goddesses in India. Indeed, the film itself announces, as you'll see on the top right, that it has only attained fruition through the grace of Santoshima. Across Hindu homes, people, especially women, continue to observe a fast on 16 consecutive Fridays in veneration of this goddess and in the hope that a particular wish might be fulfilled. How, we might ask, was this sudden efflorescence of devotion possible? John Stratton Hawley, a scholar of Hinduism, asking this very question, notes that not only do Santoshima's external features, her appearance, the colors of her clothes, her equanimous pose, and her implements, the sword and the trident, as you'll see in the picture, reproduce many of the tropes and the images familiar to the goddess iconography of India. But her very qualities, her attributes, resembled those of other goddesses long known across the subcontinent. Santoshima, in other words, grew out of and found a home in a fertile religious cultural soil where the goddess and her manifold maternal aspects had long been celebrated. Even as Santoshima therefore took part in this existing ritual symbolic universe, Hawley notes that she in some sense subsumed or integrated a certain range of pre-existing female deities. Unlike, for instance, the three goddesses who you see depicted on the right, Saraswati, Parvati, and Lakshmi, who stand as consorts to the classical triad of Hindu gods, Brahma, Shiva, and Vishnu, and whose virtues are often closely determined by these conjugal relations. Santoshima stood alone, combining in herself the spiritual power of these other female divinities. And it is often precisely this maternal aspect that allows certain goddesses to stand alone, as it were, where they're not defined by their bond or relation to a male deity. Santoshi Ma instantiated, in a word, the great goddess, the Maha Devi, a term that is frequently used in Hindu scriptural and ritual contexts for the transcendent and supreme goddess who incorporates all other goddesses. If indeed we make gods in our own image, this incident suggests that we should extend this adage to goddesses. Some Hindu women imagine goddesses that resonate with concrete aspects of their own self-understanding, whether in relatively more benign forms, such as Radha, Sita, or Lakshmi, or seemingly more malignant forms, such as Durga or Kali. The goddess is envisioned by some earthbound women as their mother, or even as their sister in heaven. The great goddess is both regal and maternal, and is revealed unto the devotee in modes which are both fear-inducing and peace-granting. Some devotional strands of Hindu spirituality claim, in fact, that the goddess, understood as the eternal consort of God, is more immediately accessible than the somewhat aloof God. Structurally speaking, the opposition that we encounter in these layers of Hindu myth is that of the materiality of the accessible divine mother and the spirituality of the incomprehensible divine father. As David Kinsley therefore points out, quote, a study of Hindu goddesses is not so much a study of one aspect of the Hindu tradition as it is a study of the Hindu tradition itself. This Maha Devi, the great goddess, or as she's known as simply Devi, the goddess, receives her earliest articulation in the 6th century Sanskrit text, the Devi Mahatmya, or the glorification of the goddess, where she is praised as the ultimate creative and all-pervading reality. This assertion of a fundamental unity underlying all goddesses in a characteristic interplay of the one and the many often takes the form of either setting forth one supreme goddess, as we find in this text, and then regarding all particular goddesses as kind of manifestations of her, or of elevating a particular goddess, such as Lakshmi or Parvati, as the supreme divine reality, or as the wife of the supreme deity, and considering all other goddesses as manifestations of her. In either case, a striking feature emerges of the Hindu goddesses, namely that they tend to be understood as closely related to one another, even, quote, possessing a common substance in a way that is somehow less true of the male gods. Although many Hindus regard the gods ultimately as rooted in or expressions of a transcendent unity, as many radiant rays of a single supreme sun, this unity takes on a distinctive intensity and intimacy in relation to the goddesses, whose various forms are often directly connected to the realities of daily living. Thus, it's worth noting that most of India's village deities are not gods, but goddesses, and are associated especially with people's local concerns. Whilst the character of each goddess might therefore be distinct, as she is shaped and suffused by the specificities of the village that she inhabits, a commonality is often asserted by calling each of these place-specific deities mother. This kind of localized part, in some sense, manifests the maternal whole. And this is also reflected in other aspects of Hinduism's, what we might call sacred geography. For instance, the great Ganges River, often referred to as Ganga Mata, Mother Ganges, is, like the Sarasvati River of the Rig Veda, the earliest of the 4 Vedas, said to be an earthly effusion of the heavenly waters that flow eternally in the divine realm. Both rivers are considered partial manifestations of their respective goddesses. The Sarasvati River is the flowing embodiment of the goddess Sarasvati, and the mighty Ganga's divine reality is tasted not only in her tangible form as river, but also in iconography, narrative, and song. Ganga Mata, or the Mother Ganges in particular, is understood as the embodiment of Shakti, meaning energy or power, who infuses with life the vast plain that she lovingly nurtures. And more generally, Shakti, which is a grammatically feminine noun, is understood as the divine feminine energy which pulsates throughout the universe and continually reproduces it. So returning to Ganga Mata, Mother Ganges, as Diana Eck points out, Mother Ganges is not only understood as present in North India as the physical site of the river, she is in fact understood to inhere wherever there is water, in all the rivers and seas of the world, and in the cyclical movements of evaporation and condensation that connect the earthly realm to heaven. In her, the heavenly Ganges, the transcendent archetype of the earthly Ganges, and all the waters of the world meet. And it is this sacred confluence that makes this goddess a mother in a unique way. So through her creative and connective energy, she effusively generates, sustains, and enriches all life. In short, the Divine Mother is the universal matrix. Expressing this life-giving potency of the Divine Mother, whose bounty nourishes us in this world and beyond, the Indian poet-philosopher Rabindranath Tagore asserts, just as, quote, the child's cry is for the mother's food, which she supplies out of her own life, so we cry to the eternal Mother, do not smite me with death, but give me the life which comes out of thine own nature. The Mother in heaven, then, is no distant matriarch, but graciously permeates our earthly abodes. And this immediacy of the Divine Mother is beautifully articulated in the narratives and the devotion that surround the deity Krishna, who is considered the supreme lord in certain Hindu traditions. Krishna's primary consort, Radha, as you'll see depicted on the screen, is often understood in these traditions as the archetypal devotee of God, who bears all the kind of problems and all the difficulties of her tempestuous love affair with Krishna. Radha is indeed often understood as Krishna's equal or even his superior, for Krishna must humble himself before her to placate her anger. And she's often angry because he often leaves her in these really delightful stories. So Krishna is celebrated in the tradition devoted to him as the enchanting and irresistible divine beloved who delights in entering into relations with his many lovers and whose blissful sporting is centered in the earthly town of Vrindavan, itself a facsimile or a kind of earthly copy of the Vrindavan in the transcendent divine realm. Focusing on the specifically maternal aspects of the Krishna narrative, here we encounter not God as mother, but the devotional sensibility of mothering God. For amongst Krishna's beloved devotees is Krishna's mother, Yashoda, whose tender exchanges with her son are narrated in a paradigmatic Hindu text, the Bhagavata Purana. The supreme deity Krishna here acts like any mischievous human child, stealing butter from a pot and denying his wrongdoing, feeling nervous that he might get caught and punished by his mother, and so on. One particularly intriguing narrative relates the Yashoda-Krishna relationship to a crucial term in Hindu theology, which is Maya. Maya is a polyvalent Sanskrit term which, depending on its philosophical and scriptural context, can carry meanings such as illusion or appearance, supernatural power, attachment, compassion, and so on. This word, itself grammatically feminine, is also generally traced to the root ma, denoting the act of making or creating. And Wendy Doniger therefore notes that Maya is the force that creates like a mother. In the Bhagavata Purana, Maya refers primarily to the multifaceted energy or power of the divine. And in contrast to its negative meaning in some other Hindu philosophies, is often used in a positive sense to denote the creative force by which Krishna creates the many universes and draws souls towards him to experience the joy of devotional love, or bhakti. In book 10 of this scriptural text, which narrates various episodes of Krishna's loving sport, or Leela, we are introduced to the purest form of this love, where Krishna's Maya facilitates the spontaneous intimacy between Krishna and his loved ones by crucially enabling them to forget that Krishna is God. For instance, in one such narrative, Krishna is playing with his friends who complain to Yashoda that Krishna has eaten mud. Krishna asserts that these accusations are false and urges Yashoda herself to look into his mouth, as seen in the image on the bottom right. Yashoda does so, and behold therein the entire cosmic manifestation, and comes to know and venerate her son as, in truth, the supreme originator, sustainer, and telos of the world. She even beholds herself sitting with Krishna and suspects that her entire worldly life is an illusion. Witnessing his mother's deep contemplation, Krishna, through his Maya, it said, causes her to forget all that she has seen, and she once again relates to him in the tenderness and intimacy of maternal love. A curious relationship is therefore set forth here between appearance and reality. On the one hand, we might suggest that Yashoda finally encounters the truth when she sees the universe in Krishna's mouth, and then goes on living the rest of her life in the illusion that she's Krishna's mother. But this text takes the opposite standpoint and affirms that Yashoda's perception of Krishna as her son is in fact the height of reality, since it enables sincere and spontaneous love between Krishna and his mother. Indeed, Yashoda's motherhood is never regarded in this text as rooted in mere illusion. On the contrary, she is repeatedly granted an exalted status as one of the emblematic devotees of Krishna. To feel oneself a mother to God and to thus love God as one's child in imitation of Yashoda is lauded, is praised in certain forms of bhakti as one of the 5 devotional sentiments that connect the devotee to God. And we see this deep maternal love articulated in the following poem by the 16th century Indian poet Surdas, known for his lyrics addressed to Krishna, in which he savors something of the joy of Yashoda's tender devotion. Yashoda lulling Hari Krishna to sleep, shaking the cradle, cuddling and fondling, singing to him a song. My darling is sleepy, why doesn't sleep come along? Come sleep, come quickly, Ganha, O Krishna, for you does long. Sometimes he closes his eyes, sometimes his lips are aflutter. Thinking he has fallen asleep, Yashoda stops her singing. Awake still, he's up suddenly, enjoying Yashoda's song. Such joy as Yashoda feels is unattainable to the gods. This intimacy of the mother-child bond as an archetype of the human-divine relation is reflected also in the maternal imagery of a very beautiful and rich text, the Guru Granth Sahib, the scriptural core of the Sikh religion and the source of Sikh ethics and religious or theological thought. And it's a text that combines many religious and devotional strands. So we find there hymns not only of the Sikh gurus, but also of Hindu devotees and poets and Sufi saints. This text begins with the first Guru, Guru Nanak's articulation of the nature of God as, quote, Ik Onkar, whose literal translation, as Nikki Guninder Kaur Singh renders it, is one being is. This supreme one is understood as beyond all spatial and temporal categories. But, as Professor Singh identifies, in the poetry of the gurus, the male and female dimensions often sit in tandem with one another. Thus, the divine is depicted in the Guru Granth Sahib as both male and female, quote, itself male, itself is female. Elsewhere, we see the entire created order playing in the lap of day and night, and the divine reality is itself regarded as the transcendent matrix from which all creatures draw their sustenance. Guru Arjan, the 5th Guru, describes God as both father, Pita, and mother, Mata, an intimate friend and brother. The supreme one is cast in a proliferation of relationships, subverting any solely paternal or patriarchal interpretation. The Guru Granth Sahib, moreover, consistently refers to our primal origin of the mother's womb, which is the fertile site of God's own creative activity. Quote, air, water, fire came together to create life, and the one performs wonders in the colourful body. Everywhere, Guru Nanak tells us, is the process of life unfolding, and so birth is no polluting or sullying force, but is the generative glow that illuminates all of God's creation. A beautifully picturesque celebration of the act of uttering the divine name, Guru Nanak calls himself the child with respect to God, who is both his father and mother, whom he addresses with the words, "Your name is like milk in my mouth." The mother's milk is depicted as satiating both physical and spiritual hunger, recalling the reflection of the poet Tagore that the newborn child finds in its mother nourishment for both the body and the soul, as the child is introduced to, quote, its true relationship with the world, namely that of personal love. The text, the divine name, is not to be distantly apprehended, but delicately and delightfully tasted, internalized, just as the child tenderly sips and is nourished by its mother's life-giving milk. Indeed, across Indic and Sufi spiritualities, the divine name is often imbued with this kind of meditative and soteriological power, which, if recited with sincerity and love, can even cure worldly woes. That this name is therefore presented as the biological and spiritual nutrition of the mother reaches right into the devotional heart of many of these religious worldviews. God is him herself, the Gurus tell us, like mother's milk for the child. And throughout the sacred text, the Gurus frequently articulate their devotion to God through the image of the infant's loving attachment to its mother's breast. My mind loves the divine, O my life, like a child loves suckling milk. The bliss of gazing upon the divine is, quote, like the look between a child and its mother, and we feel the divine embrace around us just as a mother tightly hugs her child. In short, what streams forth from the scriptural text is a celebration of the mother's being as physically and spiritually suffused with the sacred, which orients its readers and its listeners to the all-inclusive embrace of the transcendent yet imminently maternal absolute. This style of poetically maternalizing a divine reality understood as beyond gender and all worldly identities is echoed in certain strands of Islamic or Sufi spirituality, and was indeed intimated by the Prophet Muhammad himself. In a hadith or saying of the Prophet, we are told that the word rahma, meaning loving compassion, is derived from the word rahim, meaning womb, as we've explored in the earliest talk of today. And this maternal resonance of the attribute rahma was enthusiastically developed by later Sufi thinkers, like, for instance, the 12th century Andalusian philosopher Ibn Arabi, who regarded the world as a constantly engendered matrix brought into being in each moment by, in his words, the breath of the All-Merciful, the Nafas al-Rahman. The celebrated Muslim poet Rumi, whose words continue to flow through the hearts and minds of Muslims all over the world, notes that, like the mother who tenderly comforts and shelters her child, so too is God a constant refuge for the one who turns to him or her. Rumi writes, like a child that dies on its mother's lap, so will I die on the lap of mercy, of Rahmah. In these spiritual imaginations, the world lies nestled in the womb of God. And just as Guru Nanak sees the process of birth dynamically shimmering through all things, for Rumi too, every created entity from minerals to man is essentially a mother. For every finite being creates or can create something from its union with another. The structural fabric of reality is, in other words, maternal through and through. Indeed, the Quran itself, the holy text of Muslims, points to the centrality of this creative feminine attribute. Even as Islamic thought has traditionally understood the divine attributes as an interplay of opposites, in which no single one predominates, the divine name that appears most often in the Quran is Al-Rahman. And the Prophet himself, aside from setting forth this connection between compassion and the womb, also asserted that on the day God created the heavens and the earth, he created 100 rahmas, each of which is as great as the space which lies between heaven and earth. And he sent one rahmah down to earth, by which a mother has rahmah for her child. In another hadith or saying of the Prophet, it is related that when a woman found her lost child and the Prophet's companions wept upon seeing her joy, the Prophet delighted in their rahmah and asserted, quote, "Do you wonder at this woman's rahmah for her child? By him in whose hand is my soul, on the day of judgment, God shall show more rahmah towards his believing servant than this woman has shown to her son." Incidentally, owing to the kind of historical and linguistic roots which connect Arabic and Persian to the languages of North India, this kind of field, this semantic field that is drawn from the Arabic root of raham is also used in the Guru Granth Sahib, the text we just explored, to describe the infinite mercy of the divine. The saints and prophets of Islam too, crucially, are imagined as mothers. For instance, in Rumi's declaration that the, quote, anger of prophets is like that of mothers, an anger filled with tenderness for her pretty child. This maternal bounty is archetypally true of the Prophet Muhammad, described in the Quran as a mercy, a rahmat, for all the worlds. And many Sufi poets have sung of the maternal embrace of the Prophet, in whose cooling breeze or shade they find refuge from the turbulences of the world. We might, in this context, move closer to home and consider the German poet Goethe's famous lyrical celebration of the Prophet in his Song of Muhammad, in which he presents the life of Muhammad as a stream which flows abundantly through the valley. Although the poet probably did not have this Indic parallel in mind, one cannot help but consider this image alongside that of the Ganga Mata, the mother Ganges, that we explored above, of the resplendent maternal stream that imparts life to its environing world. Crucially, Muslim poets have also often their own spiritual quest, a distinctively maternal dimension. The pains of childbirth have been re-envisioned by these writers as a metaphor for the pains that precede one's spiritual purification. Just as the birth of a child is accompanied by severe pangs, so too does the flower of spiritual growth often blossom after experiences of pain and hardship. In text, Rumi writes, the body is like Mary, or Maryam, as she's known in the Islamic tradition. Each of us has a Jesus within, but our Jesus will not be born before we experience pain. If pain never comes, Jesus will return to his origins along the same mysterious path by which he came. And on this connection with Mary, again, the poet Rumi affirmed that just as Mary had to be a virgin to bear the divine word, the Prophet Muhammad too was famously illiterate, so that the revelation of God in book, the Quran, could be, so to speak, inspired to and in him. And here the word for illiterate is in Arabic, ummi, a word etymologically connected to the word or mother in Arabic. So those who are reborn in this way become in turn the beloved children of God, echoing Guru Nanak's description of the tender gaze that the mother and child share. The medieval Islamic theologian Al-Ghazali, in his treatise on divine love and longing, relates God's utterance to his lovers, quote, "You are my beloved ones, my chosen, my friends. I rejoice in your jubilance and I hurry towards your love. I gaze upon you hourly with the gaze of a tender and pitying mother." And instantiating the notion of the divine name as maternal nourishment, God here asserts of his devotee, "I draw him close to the light of my countenance. If he falls sick, I nurse him the way a tender mother nurses her child. If he is thirsty, I give him to drink, and I let him taste the savor of mentioning me." What we see then across these devotional fabrics drawn from a range of a selected range of Hindu, Sikh, and Islamic religious universes, is a striking range of recurrent themes. The divine reality as universal matrix who bestows and sustains life. The depiction of this nourishing transcendence through concrete earthly imageries. The importance of the maternal gaze. The poetic rendering of God's very name as maternal nutrition. The exaltation of the mother-child relation as symbolic of the human-divine bond. This is not, of course, to suggest that each tradition's nuanced understandings of the divine feminine can be neatly correlated or somehow conflated with the others, but rather to set forth the fertile possibilities that emerge when these imageries and traditions are read alongside one another. As a final note on the divine feminine in and across South Asian worldviews, we might reflect on how this trope has been utilized and appropriated for certain socio-political ends across the subcontinent's history. What does it mean, for instance, for the modern nation state of India itself to be cast as a goddess, as Bharat Mata or Mother India, whose purity and honor is often seen as imperiled by internal or external threats? More broadly, we might consider what this maternal imagery or this variegated celebration of the divine feminine means for women on the ground, who both in South Asia and beyond must often navigate patriarchal and oppressive structures. Can the goddess or the divine mother more generally be a liberating and redeeming figure? And if she often hasn't been or hasn't been allowed to be, how might we imagine anew her emancipatory glory? Thank you. Thank you for your patience.
Hina, thank you very much indeed. There is such richness and clarity. I was very struck, actually, when you were talking about how something, I understood you correctly, the mother in Hinduism, often the local goddesses have a sort of a commonality. The way that in the Bible, particularly in the books of wisdom and Sirach, there are lots of titles given to wisdom. She's subtle, intelligent, she's a pure mirror of the Most High. Something's going on here. So thank you very much indeed.